Professor Federico Stuznegger and members of this distinguished audience. Good morning, and thank you, Professor, for that very quick presentation, which, yes, of course, was somewhat of a music to our ears. But monetary policy is always challenging, and there cannot be any scope for any kind of complacency at any point of time. Now, I'm delighted to be back at this Kautilya Economic Conclave 2023. This is the second edition. I did participate last year also. This event is emerging as a leading forum for well-rounded discourse on economic and other policy issues of contemporary relevance. I'm sure the eminent gathering here will contribute richly to the deliberations during the next 2 or 3 days. Now, in the opening line of my latest monetary policy statement on October 6, I had referred to Kautilya's emphasis on stability in the macroeconomic context. I now propose to share my thoughts on managing the complementarities and the trade-offs associated with price and financial stability. I also propose to touch upon the policy mix to achieve these desirable goals and our experience in India in dealing with these issues. Evidently, the choice of this topic draws inspiration from the nomenclature of this economic conclave, namely the Kautilya Economic Conclave. But let me first begin by touching upon the current global context. The global economy is now facing a triad of challenges. First, slow moderation in inflation, which is getting interrupted by recurring and overlapping shocks. Second, slowing growth, and that too with fresh and enhanced obstacles. And third, lurking risks of financial stability. Central banks with price stability as their primary objective have raised policy rates aggressively while signaling to keep the rates higher for longer. Some of the central banks have indeed taken a pause on rate hikes also. Financial stability concerns, along with other factors, have conditioned this pursuit following the recent banking sector turmoil in some advanced economies. Financial markets have become highly sensitive to every piece of new information. Policy making has become extraordinarily complex in the middle of such confluence of factors. Increasingly, central bankers face tensions between doing too little or doing too much. While several central banks may prefer the prudence of overkill, somewhat embodied in higher for longer policy stances, financial instability risks rise up to restrain them. With every shock, such as the recent simultaneous surge of crude oil prices, bond yields, and the US dollar, additional dimensions of policy dilemma present themselves and hamstring the responses of the central banks. In such a situation, conflict may arise between the requirements of price and financial stability. But policymakers have to deftly trade a fine balance, as it is important to recognize that price and financial stability reinforce each other in the medium to the long term. Stability is the foundation of sustained progress. As Kautilya explained long ago, and he puts first a question and then he answers it, and I quote, Kautilya first asks, which is preferable, an immediate small gain or a large gain in the future? And then he goes on to answer. He says that a large gain in the future is preferable if it is like a seed yielding fruit in the future. Against this background, let me start with the evolution of the idea of price and financial stability in the global context. The role of central banks had, as all of you would be aware, had evolved by the 19th century as they came to be recognized primarily as the lender of the last resort. Now, this lender of the last resort principle remains the cornerstone of modern central banking, and its scope has widened over time to encompass financial stability. And this financial stability is in respect of, as you would know, markets and financial institutions. Historically, therefore, financial stability has been the core remit of central banks, involving both prevention and management of financial crises. By the second half of the 20th century, inflation surges worldwide caused by post-war fiscal activism and recurring oil price shocks in the backdrop of stagnating economic activity resulted in price stability being recognized as the prime objective of central banks. As inflation targeting gained ground from the early 1990s, a widely accepted view emerged that monetary policy should primarily or perhaps solely focus on price stability, with financial stability falling in the domain of prudential regulation and supervision. Price stability was increasingly seen as the best guarantee of financial stability. The extended period of steady growth and low and stable inflation during the so-called Great Moderation era of 1990s and early 2000s lulled central banks into a sense of complacency with regard to regulation and supervision of the financial system. Quietly and in parallel, the seeds of financial instability were germinating. Soon, therefore, the conventional wisdom of price stability being an automatic stabilizer of the financial system got wiped off in favor of the view that price stability on its own would not necessarily safeguard financial stability. This view was further reinforced by the global financial crisis of 2008. Governor Subba Rao in 2012 acknowledged this, stating that, and I quote, "The global financial crisis, followed by the Eurozone debt crisis, has changed the theology of central banking in a fundamental way. The orthodoxy of central banking before the 2008 crisis was single objective, price stability, single instrument, short-term interest rate. The crisis came as a powerful rebuke to central banks for having neglected financial stability in their single-minded pursuit of price stability," unquote. During the global financial crisis, central banks globally undertook large-scale monetary stimulus to depress interest rates to ultra-low levels and rekindle the animal spirits among investors and households. These measures were aimed at restoring financial stability in the near term, but ended up threatening the future of price stability, thus posing an intertemporal trade-off between price and financial stability. In other words, the large-scale monetary and fiscal accommodation undertaken to address financial stability risks during the global financial crisis and in the period thereafter sowed the seeds of inflationary pressures in the subsequent years. In the meantime, central banks had become more proactive on issues of financial stability. Now, central banks again faced a trade-off between price and financial stability during the COVID-19 pandemic as economic activity came to a standstill amidst elevated global commodity prices and disruption of supply chains. As the global financial system became awash with stimulus-injected liquidity, concerns were raised about the implication of the liquidity glut for price stability. With the commencement of the war in Ukraine, these concerns materialized and inflation surged to 40-year high levels. The unprecedented rate hikes, which was undertaken by central banks, have resulted in large erosion in profitability of some banks in the advanced economies. Obviously, these banks had not adequately factored in the interest rate risks associated with a reversal of the accommodative policy stance pursued by the central banks during the pandemic. The collapse or the failure of some of these banks, particularly in the advanced economies, demonstrated the reverse causality of the trade-off mentioned earlier. In other words, the measures undertaken during the global financial crisis to restore financial stability sowed the seeds of future price instability risks. while this time around after the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, the measures to address price stability led to concerns relating to financial instability in some parts of the world. Summing up, the last 2 decades have revealed multiple linkages running between financial stability to price stability and vice versa. Measures for promoting financial stability can complement or constrain monetary policy depending upon its usage. And this is very important. Eventually, what matters is the usage of various instruments in the pursuit of financial stability and price stability. Now, financial stability measures aimed at, and I would now like to elaborate, financial stability measures aimed at effective regulation and supervision of banks, non-banking financial companies, that is like NBFCs, and markets can enhance monetary transmission and help achieving price stability. Whereas, on the other hand, financial stability measures via extraordinary monetary expansion, if not corrected timely, can jeopardize price stability. Similarly, the linkage from price to financial stability also operates in 2 ways. First, I talked about financial stability to price stability, and now I am focusing on, the linkage from price to financial stability, and I would like to show how it operates. Now, it operates in 2 ways. First, extended period of low and stable inflation could lead to financial instability through complacency loop, as explained earlier. And prolonged periods of depressed growth can keep prices in check, but they could also lead to financial instability. Second, periods of high inflation that are addressed by strong monetary policy tightening can deter financial stability if interest rate risks are not adequately factored in. It is therefore evident that the relationship between price stability and financial stability depends upon the policy choices that we make. Now let me focus on the Indian experience, especially in the recent years. The Reserve Bank, with its assigned responsibility to maintain monetary stability and price stability, also has the larger responsibility of maintaining financial stability, as it is the regulator and supervisor of the banks and other non-financial sector entities like the NBFCs and the like, and also the financial markets. Unlike price stability, financial stability is not specifically defined and it's not explicitly quantifiable. Now, inflation, you can say that the target is 4% or 5% or 2%, whatever. But how do you define financial stability and how do you quantify financial stability is something which is not possible. Particularly the quantification of financial stability, it's not, at least I have not come across any such formulation. Now, as a result, it has been interpreted, that is, financial stability has been interpreted subjectively, specific to context and circumstances. My illustrious predecessor, Governor Y.V. Reddy, defined financial stability in central banking parlance as, and I quote, "Financial stability refers to the smooth functioning of financial markets and institutions. It does not mean absence or avoidance of crisis, but presence of conditions conducive to efficient functioning without serious disruption." I would now like to touch upon the recent years, how the Reserve Bank has managed this trade-off which we face at times, the complementarity between financial and price stability. Now, the unique combination of the Reserve Bank's responsibility of being in charge of monetary policy making and also being the regulator of the financial sector and having macroprudential regulation and microprudential supervision entrusted to it. Now, this combination of functions of the Reserve Bank has enabled the Reserve Bank to focus both on financial and price stability even during the recent years of multiple overlapping and unprecedented shocks coming one after the other. I am referring to the post-ILFS crisis, COVID-19 pandemic, war in Ukraine, unparalleled tightening of interest rates and financial volatilities in that order which we have witnessed in the recent years. Now, following the collapse of the ILFS in the second half of 2018, almost the entire 2019, so far as Reserve Bank is concerned, the entire 2019 necessitated taking measures to intensify the supervision of the NBFCs, close monitoring of their liquidity and stability conditions, infusing system liquidity through innovative instruments like currency buy-sell swaps, which we undertook in March and April 2019, restoring market confidence through appropriate communication and backing it up with actual action on several fronts. Now, during the entire 2019, the financial markets had almost frozen, liquidity had tightened, and what is more, there was a kind of a crisis of confidence in the financial markets. So the whole of 2019, we were monitoring the activities of the functioning of the non-bank finance companies, that is the NBFCs, both at the aggregate and systemic level, as well as at the level of individual entities. We were monitoring their stability conditions, we were monitoring their asset liability conditions, we were monitoring the liquidity, the inflow, outflow of liquidity. There was a kind of a commitment, in fact, literally, I remember having stuck my neck out when one of the post-monetary policy conferences, press conferences that year, somewhere in June, where, when several questions were asked by the media, and there was a kind of, I could see that there was a crisis of confidence. In fact, I literally stuck my neck out and the neck of the Reserve Bank when I made a commitment that it will be our endeavor to ensure that there is no more failure of a large or a major non-bank finance company. It was a big challenge for our supervision team, for our regulation team in Reserve Bank, but I am happy to share with you that whatever commitment we made, we were able to maintain that, and that was possible because of intensive monitoring, intensive supervision, almost on a weekly basis, and backing it up with actual action in terms of regulatory measures. When COVID-19 pandemic scarred the global economy, now I would like to move on. When COVID-19 pandemic scarred the global economy, including India, our response was swift and decisive. We put in place business continuity measures even before the nationwide lockdown was announced. And the quarantine facility that we set up to run the financial market operations, it's already well known, so I am not elaborating on that. The policy repo rate was reduced sizably by 115 basis points in a span of 2 months, that is between March and May 2020. Unlike advanced economy central banks, which eased rates close to the zero lower bound, we did not reduce the policy repo rate below our inflation target of 4%. Financial conditions were eased substantially by further reducing the reverse repo rate, which lowered the floor rate of the Reserve Bank's liquidity adjustment corridor. This became the effective anchor of money market rates. In addition, liquidity enhancing measures equivalent to 8.7% of GDP were announced. Our liquidity measures were unique in several ways. Liquidity was provided only through Reserve Bank's counterparties, that is banks. Asset purchase program, or the GSAP as was popularly known, was for a limited period of 6 months. Collateral standards were not diluted while offering lending facilities, and most of these liquidity injection measures were targeted and had pre-announced sunset clauses which helped in their orderly unwinding. In parallel, macroprudential measures like moratorium on repayment of bank and NBFC loans for 6 months, followed by resolution frameworks for COVID-19 stressed assets, were also announced. These resolution frameworks were offered for limited period and were not open-ended, but subject to achievement of certain financial and operational parameters. It may be noted that all these measures which we took during the pandemic and immediately thereafter, it may be noted that all these measures were nuanced, keeping in mind the price and financial stability challenges they may create in the future. Every decision that we took, we were weighing it from the perspective of what risks it will pose to financial stability, what risks it will pose to price stability going forward. And that sort of determined almost all our policy making during that period. Interestingly, the Reserve Bank's balance sheet size, which had expanded to 28.6% of GDP in 2021, that is during the first year of the pandemic, from 24.6% in 2019-20. Let me repeat. The Reserve Bank's balance sheet size, which had expanded to 28.6% of GDP in 2021, from 24.6% in 2019-20, has moderated to about 22.5% of GDP in the last financial year 22-23, going below even its pre-pandemic level. During 2021, the surplus liquidity was gradually migrated from the short end to the longer horizon through variable rate reverse repo auctions of longer tenors, which lifted short-term rates from ultra-low levels, thereby obviating financial stability challenges. This was done by sensitizing the market well in advance through effective communication. The period since the onset of the pandemic was an example of how the Reserve Bank could effectively address macro stability consideration of maintaining price stability through conventional and unconventional monetary policy within the flexibility provided by the flexible inflation targeting framework, while also addressing financial stability considerations simultaneously. The flexibility provided by the dual mandate in our flexible inflation targeting framework, the flexibility provided under this framework of maintaining price stability while keeping in mind the objective of growth, along with the provision of a tolerance band around the target rate of 4%, helped us to accommodate large supply-side shocks while focusing on immediate growth concerns during the pandemic. Subsequently, when the shock of Ukraine war struck in 2022 and there was a sudden surge in inflation, we quickly changed gears by prioritizing inflation over growth and shifting the monetary policy stance from being accommodative to withdrawal of accommodation. Further, given that the nature of inflation process in India was driven largely by supply-side shocks, proactive supply-side measures taken by the government aided to temper the price impulses. Focusing again on the current context, after raising the policy repo rate by 250 basis points cumulatively between May last year and February this year, with the quantum of rate hikes being calibrated in tune with the evolving inflation outlook, we have maintained a pause on policy rates in 23-24 so far. The 250 basis points rate hike is still working through the financial system. We have also appropriately fine-tuned our communication to ensure successful transmission of the interest rate hikes. The prevailing global environment of slowing growth and stubborn inflation, especially in the last few miles before reaching the target. Now, on the one hand, the growth is now slowing down. I'm talking about the global situation. There is a global slowdown of growth, and even the IMF has projected. And the last few miles, almost for every central bank, before the central banks reach their targets, the inflation, it seems to be becoming stubborn. And against this background, economic activity in India exhibits resilience on the back of strong domestic demand. Real GDP growth for 23-24, that is for the current year, is projected at 6.5% by the Reserve Bank, and India is poised to become the new growth engine of the world. We remain extra vigilant on the evolving inflation dynamics. Headline CPI inflation has moderated sharply to 5% in September, with correction in vegetable prices. The outlook on food inflation, however, is beset with uncertainties. On the positive side, core inflation, that is CPI inflation excluding food and fuel has eased by around 170 by 170 basis points to 4.5% from its peak in January 23, January this year. We have projected headline CPI inflation at 5.4% for the current financial year. As evident from our survey of September 2023, there is further progress on anchoring of inflation expectations, which entered the single-digit zone for the first time since the COVID-19 pandemic. In the current situation, monetary policy must remain actively disinflationary to ensure that ongoing disinflation process progresses smoothly. On the financial stability front, throughout the multiple shocks in the recent period, the Reserve Bank has adopted a prudent approach and taken several initiatives to revamp regulation and supervision of the banks, the NBFCs, and other financial sector entities by developing an integrated and harmonized architecture. The Indian financial sector has been stable and resilient, as reflected in sustained growth in bank credit backed by improved asset quality, adequate capital and liquidity buffers, and robust earnings growth. Macro stress tests for credit risk reveal that scheduled commercial banks in India would be able to comply with the minimum capital requirements even under severe stress scenarios. The financial indicators of the non-banking financial companies, that is NBFCs, are also in line with that of the broader financial system as per June 2023 data. There is, however, no room for complacency because it is during good times that vulnerabilities may creep in. Hence, buffers are best built up during good times. Banks, NBFCs, and other financial sector entities should remain vigilant and complete the pending repairs, if any, to their houses. Roofs need to be fixed, walls need to be further strengthened, and foundations need to be augmented when the weather is good to withstand potential adverse weather events in the future. Let me now conclude. Price stability and financial stability, they complement each other. In fact, price stability is an anchor for financial stability, but the trade-off between the two becomes a close call at times. It has been our endeavor in the Reserve Bank to manage these complementarities and trade-offs as efficiently as possible, while according priority to price stability, keeping in mind the objective of growth as mandated under the law. We treat financial stability as non-negotiable. Our policies and choices of instruments are guided by this holistic approach. We have strengthened our macroeconomic fundamentals and buffers, and these are imparting resilience to the economy to withstand large shocks and navigate in an increasingly turbulent and uncertain global setting. Alan Greenspan, the former Fed chair, once said, I quote, "More fundamentally, an environment of greater economic stability has been key to the impressive growth in much of the world," unquote. India's economic performance in recent years lends credence